An animation plays with words coming in from different directions that reads, National Council on Independent Living Oral History Project. Interview with founding member and pioneer Charlie Carr.
Goes back quite a long time. In 1982, there was a meeting of the first 10 funded Title VII states. It was held in Lansing, Michigan, and most of the people that attended this event were then CIL directors from the first 10 funded Title VII states. And one of the things that we talked about was having a national presence, right? And Max Starkoff, our Mark Bristow came and addressed the group and basically said, we'd like to do this, Is there anyone that wants to? After that 3-day meeting, we got Max, Mark, and I got together and we began planning for the establishment of Nickel. And it was not a nonprofit yet. It was just a gathering of people. So we had our first meeting in late 1982. It was in Washington, D.C. There were about 35 of us. And of course, there was no funding to support us. So we had to get our senators to fund us. And at this meeting, we talked about what kind of a model that we want to use. And the model that we wanted to use was the ACCD model, American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. And so that was a number of board members with an executive director. But we didn't have any monies. So anyway, we decided that we were going to have a structure where we would have a president, two vice presidents, and then a number of people on the boards. So we elected Max Starkoff as our president, and then Mark Bristow was the external vice president, and I was the internal vice president. So we had our structure, and then we decided that we were going to invite other people that weren't necessarily from the first Title VII-funded, which we did at the second meeting. And we brought on people like John Chappell from Virginia. We brought on 2 or 3 others. So that was the beginning. We just started to have quarterly meetings. We would travel to states where board members were from, and who ran CILs. And little by little, we pecked away at what our national contacts would be. And I think the biggest thing that we worked on was Title VII, which was signed into law in 1978, but it was kind of dormant. It really hadn't gone very far. So we started meeting some members of Congress and their staff. We talked about expanding beyond the 10 states, and then eventually we were able to get that. And we talked about the need for standards and indicators for centers, and we got that eventually passed. It assured us that the board and majority of management staff were people with disabilities. Majority was defined as 51%. So that was kind of how we started things up. There was a framework that CIL in Berkeley has set up, and we, some centers followed it, some centers didn't, and we wanted uniformity among the centers, right? And the only thing that differentiated a center for independent living from another ordinary provider at that time was advocacy. And so we wanted to make sure that advocacy was a component. So we arrived at the 4 key services. We wanted to be able to say, okay, a center does A, B, and C consistently across the country. And that's what we used when we developed the standards and indicators. So I think that was the principle, was continuity, ensuring that we had a good a good communication channel. And that was my job as internal vice president, was to make sure that all of their 40 something centers, we used to do monthly phone calls and just kind of check in with each other. And then we had 3 annual meetings, and I coordinated those annual meetings. They started off, like I said, about 35 people attending, and by the time I left doing that, after the third one, there probably more like 125 centers and staff that came to the annual meetings. This was pre everything. Part of my job was I was the first person that headed up the Legislative and Advocacy Committee, and we worked on the Air Carriers Access Act. We worked on fair housing amendments. We worked on a number of other pieces of legislation and used the power of our members that were growing. Was we got the Congress to allocate money to all 50 states. So it was we were building an advocacy machine that we eventually would use to work to get the ADA passed. We were certainly unequal in every regard. We weren't seen as almost as humans. We were seen as some kind of anomaly. And so life back then was, if you have a disability, you should be on Social Security for the rest of your life and live in poverty. So it's very different. The Architectural Barriers Act was enacted in 1968. So that was about ensuring the curb cuts and all that kind of stuff were made. But, an act is only as good as what people make it. For me, in the work that I did, it was looking at all the different legislation that was coming down that needed to be reauthorized. And fair housing amendments were huge. I mean, there were very few provisions for accessible, affordable housing. And we worked very hard on that one and got them to increase the percentage of all handicapped units at the time from 5% to 15%. And so that was huge because our goal, Matt, was to get people out of nursing homes, right? And it's great if we can do it, but where are they going to live? Which was a prototype, really, for the money follows the person years later. So that was one huge thing. And the other thing, honestly, was getting people educated about independent living and letting them know that there is life outside of the four walls of a nursing home. And as a huge piece of that, PAS was extremely important. So we met nationally with the World Institute on Disabilities several times and had PAS conferences, and we were able to get state by state to adopt PAS programs. So again, primarily for people with physical disabilities. So there's a combination of PAS, housing, all the legislation that I mentioned, and getting the member centers of nickel that were growing informed, answering questions about what they could do to help to get various things accomplished. So it was evolutionary. It was very exciting. We never had a national president. We never had access to Congress, members of Congress. We didn't have that kind of stuff. So to be able to do that was huge for us. We developed relationships with key people, Bobby Silverstein and others, who gave us access to people like Tom Harkin and others that were champions. And so people are extremely excited. And when we got to our meetings, we would just spend a good hour or two just talking about here's the barriers I'm running into in my state. How can we get around them? I think people may have been a little confused about, well, this state is doing it this way, that state is doing that way. And the funding sources are different state by state. So it had to be, it had to be tailored to each particular state because each one was different. for the first 10 Title VII-funded states. When we got the law passed, eventually we got them to agree to fund 10 states. And
Okay.
those 10 states were the ones that came to that meeting in Lansing, Michigan to form eventually form Nichols. Eventually we were able to get funding to every state, but that took time. So there were just a large number of Title VII funded centers. So as more money came in to fund individual states, membership grew and grew and grew until I don't know what there are now, 400 some odd centers around the country. So it was evolutionary. It was a lengthy process, but I'd say after the 10 and then the appropriation agreement to fund additional states, it took about 5 or 6 years before all the states were able to apply for funding to be Title VII. I would say when Madison's time was the reauthorization of the Fair Housing Act. That was huge for us to have. And yeah, there were other groups, but we really weighed in as a strong group of senators. So that was a big moment. Felt good about it. And leadership, lots of people from the old guard would come and share their stories with us. People like Lex Reed and others who would come and spend time talking with us, and sometimes we agreed with them, sometimes didn't, but it was very helpful. So I would say the Fair Housing Act was huge, and then there was something called the Civil Rights Restoration Act, and that was the precursor of the ADA. So we got to see Civil Rights Restoration Act passed. The person that really drove that was Lex Frieden from Houston. So we got behind that and it passed. And basically, it built a 504 and broadened it beyond just federal, and it broadened it to the broader public in terms of access. So that was a big victory, and it laid the groundwork for what eventually would become the ADA. So then we got to get in to see Vice President Bush at the time, and the reason that we got in to see him was because of the relationship of Evan Kemp and Justin Dart with the Reagan administration. So we got access to them. We flooded it. We flooded in and we met with Bush, and we basically said, look, we want civil rights that were excluded from the Civil Rights Act. And that's for people with disabilities, not just people of color. And there were all kinds of red flags and, oh my God, this costs too much money, etc. He was really receptive to the intent, but we got him to promise that if we got the bill passed, that he would make sure that it would be signed. The time passed, and Reagan left, and Bush then was president, right? There's a lot of work to get behind the scenes to get the ADA passed. That was all orchestrated by Adapt, Bob Kafka. The other thing about the ADA and the role that Nickel played that was really an important role is among ourselves, we had almost all of the different disability organizations on board, but deaf people held out. They said, well, we're not disabled, we're deaf, and in order to bring them into the fold, and we really needed them. I reached out to Frank Bowe, somebody I'd known for a long time, a good person, a reasonable guy. He was previously the executive director of the ACCD. At the time, he was I have to think about the name of the university. And I said, Frank, look, whether or not the deaf community identifies itself as being disabled or not, you're certainly not getting protection under the law. So we created a new title in the act. It was, I believe it was Title V, telecommunications. And that was the way that we reached out. And all of branch and pulled in the deaf community. And the reason that was so important is because there was a whole group of people now that help us to bomb the Congress with visits, emails, all that kind of stuff. So it was a process. And it was like, what can you do for me sometimes? And I understand that everybody wants a piece of advice. So my job was to get as many groups together to be on the same page to get the ADA passed. Lex is he's a high level quad. He was very influential in transportation in Houston. He eventually started the Houston Center for Independent Living, and then went on later to start independent living research utilization, which is more of a research oriented group. I've known Lex for many years. He's a good friend. He was huge, and a Republican and somebody that was involved in the National Council of Disability. And then Justin Dart. Justin was he was a major character. He was a guy that came from privilege. His father was a member of Reagan's kitchen cabinet. Through him, we got access to the highest levels of government, namely Vice President Bush, and then eventually to Reagan. And Justin did something really wild. Like I said, he had a lot of money. So he went around to all 50 states and he met with leaders of the disability community and got each of us to write a story about why we felt the need for, civil rights. And he kept all these emails and stories, and he almost created a diary, and that later led to the publication called Towards Independence, which was an NCD recommendation that, among other things, the ADA was supposed to be passed. Justin was commissioner of RSA for a while, and he made some statements of conscience that he basically lost his job, and it didn't matter to him. What was important to him was that people understood that somebody of his caliber spoke out against what the administration was doing. Everyone had a leader. In Massachusetts, it was Elmer Martell. Elmer was very involved in the passage of the Architectural Barriers Act in 1968. He was the voc rehab commissioner for something like 35 years. And while he was in offices when we got chosen as one of the 10 Title VII states. Not that he played a huge role in that happening, but it happened under his watch, and he was gracious enough to give us innovation and expansion and money prior to Title VII coming, which allowed us to begin the preparation for Max Starkloff was huge in Missouri around transportation. Marco Pristo was huge in Chicago around transportation and other issues. So a lot of time was spent on transportation and coordinating with ADAPT, who was very, very involved in everything from training themselves to buses to all that it took to get transportation on the minds of local and federal legislators. And so there's a lot of coordination with ADAPT, and ADAPT created state chapters. And we were all young. I was probably in my mid 20s. And so we were full of piss and vinegar. We wanted things to get done, and we didn't want to sit idly by and lose this opportunity to have a national voice. So Nickel gave us power. It gave us continuity. Our messaging was clear. It was consistent. and we had power, and we became a force to be reckoned with in DC, which was great. It was a great feeling to get up before different committees and give testimony and so on and so forth. So I would say power was something that we didn't have and we got, and we never let go. Never let go of it. Of course, here we are sitting on the south lawn of the White House with Justin Dart, Evan Kemp, and this Reverend, who I forget. And when Bush said those unforgettable words, I lift my pen that will basically give freedom to thousands of Americans, it was just incredible joy. So, but the thing about any legislative initiative and an act that was passed, there had to be case after case of case law to build and form what the law was going to look like in terms of practical implementation. So there was a very famous case of a deaf guy that worked for a train. I'm not specifically familiar with the details, but they said he couldn't do his job because he was deaf, right? And of course he could. He could do his job. He didn't need to hear what he was doing in terms of running this train. So he won. And case after case where we would win. And that fleshed out what things the ADA would cover. And so that, of course, led to the Olmstead in 1999, which, of course, was our magnum opus in terms of case law that came out of the ADA. And basically, what it said was, here you've got these two women with significant developmental disabilities that want to get out of an institution, and they wouldn't, the state wouldn't pay for it. And Olmstead used ADA as case law and said, no, these women are entitled to live in the community at the expense of the state, and they won. And so that was an example of how the ADA was used to springboard into something as critically important as the Olmstead decision that was made by the Supreme Court. So that's where we had a friendly Supreme Court. So beside the Capitol crowd, we occupied the Capitol building. We chained ourselves together. We sat and watched the deliberations in the House. We found out who was for it, who wasn't for it, and we targeted the people that weren't for it. And fortunately, Ted Kennedy, one of the champions of the ADA, was my senator, and I knew him really well, and so he played a huge role behind the scenes getting the ADA passed in the Senate and in the House. Tony Quello played a huge role in getting the House to finally come around and pass the ADA. It was done with the backdrop of all these demonstrations of people just, demanding that the act be passed. So there were lots of arrests, particularly when we chained ourselves together in the Capitol building. They didn't know what to do. I mean, they didn't know how to. They dragged us out of there on our back wheels. It was nuts. And so they, little by little, they became more aware of how to disengage the wheelchairs. But yeah, it was crazy times, man, and it was great times. I mean, there was such feelings, solidarity, and accomplishment, along with frustration. Like, is this ever gonna be passed? And like I said, the victory, the feeling of triumph, and the feeling of joy when the bill was signed was just so uplifting. And for me, my 4th of July, my freedom really is on the 26th of July when the ADA was passed. I came from being institutionalized for 7 years, right? Because there were no community-based alternatives to live. And so for me to be able to sit out there in front of the president signing this bill was like, oh my God, I'm free. But think of all the thousands of other people that eventually experienced that same freedom. It was just a great feeling. I mean, right now it's all about building emerging leaders and people that will carry the torch for all the work that we did, and to make sure that the work we did is maintained and then built on. And how are we going to do that if we don't, if we don't teach disability history? And one of the panels that was at the national conference did a panel on teaching disability history. They're from Massachusetts, and we've got like a law that says public schools have to have a curriculum on disability histories. So there's a model to be used there, but Nicholas as a whole needs to groom these young people coming up. And the best way to do that, Matt, is to let them know what life was like before Nickel and what life is like now. And all the people that made it happen.